Good evening, and thank you for taking some time to meet with us tonight about our Lake Washington School District budget update. We've been meeting with our internal stakeholders throughout the week, sharing this information, and look forward to providing you with information about our budget outlook and our future. I want to recognize our full board of directors for their leadership and advocacy for our students and community in Lake Washington. I want to specifically recognize directors Lindsay Yoakum and Lisa Guthrie, who are present here tonight with us. I want to start with a bit of an agenda. We've broken this into three different parts. Part one is the basics. About 10 minutes should give you the information that you would need to really understand our situation, the solution, and the timeline associated with that. If you're interested in more of the details around our budget, our revenues, expenditures, and those components, part two is about 20 minutes to provide a more detailed view. And then we'll have time at the end for question and answers. And we've invited some guests from our budget advisory committee to come and provide comments as well. You'll see on your screen, there's a leave button, and right next to that is a queue. If you want to go ahead and start submitting questions throughout the presentation, we'll collect those and use those for that part three Q&A session, knowing that some of those questions are going to be answered during the presentation. Some of the questions are better suited for an FAQ, and some of those questions will be better answered live here tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into part one. So part one, I'm going to cover our situation, why are we in this situation, the solution, the timeline associated with it, and the process that any of our stakeholders can expect as we think about changes and adjustments moving forward. But I want to start with really at a high level, what is a sustainable and an effective budget? First and foremost, it's that we have a consistent process to project both short and long-term budget information. Lake Washington School District has a long history of projecting our budget out about 10 years, knowing that it's important for us to really think in long term to understand where we may be going. And so our process to project has been in place for many, many years. Second is that transparent and available information for our public and our community. We provide information on our district website, both the technical documents that we submit to OSPI and the state related to our budget, but we also translate that information into a much more user-friendly version that provides information about how revenue comes in, the expenditures, and how it's aligned to our district direction. And that's that next piece here, that our budget is responsive to the direction of our school district, always targeting student success. And so as we think about all students in Lake Washington being successful, we know that our budget is a key part of accomplishing that. We also know that part of a successful, sustainable, and effective budget is that we have budget reserves to meet a couple of different key priorities. One, our legal and policy requirements. There are conditions that we're required to maintain for our budget reserves, and so we do that. But we also know that we need a rainy day fund for emergent issues, challenges that arise, so that we can be responsive to those situations. And then lastly, we know that a sustainable and effective budget has revenues and expenditures that are aligned. So the dollars coming in and the dollars going out do have an alignment. That's where our challenge is right now, and that's the issue that we'll be solving over the next couple of years. And that leads right into the situation. Our situation is that our revenues and expenditures are not aligned, meaning that our expenditures are higher than the revenue, the dollars coming in. And so by the 25-26 school year, we will need to reduce our expenditures by 2.7%. And for Lake Washington, that's about $11 to $15 million annually. So a good next question is, well, why are we in this situation? And I want to walk through a few different components. One, first and foremost, we did have a plan, long-term plan to right-size our budget reserves. And in the part two, I'm going to dig into a little bit more about some of those changes in state funding in the 17-18, 18-19 school year. But it was all the way back then when we actually started planning for what was some unknowns in our budget picture. And so we did build up our budget reserves to be responsive to that. And we have been responsibly spending our budget reserves down, knowing that there is a right size for our budget reserves, and we didn't want it to be too high. And so that is a long-term plan that we have been implementing over time. One of the things the changes in state funding did was it did limit and reduce the local levy ability of school districts. And so right now, Lake Washington partners with our community around our educational programs and operations levy. And that allows us to enhance the educational programs and services for our students. It is true that there is a lack of full funding from the state for many of the programs and services, many of them required programs and services. Something that all of us are experiencing in our personal life, rising costs, the impacts of inflation. That's true for our organization as well. And then you may have heard the story of declining enrollment in public education in Washington State. Again, I'm going to dig into more of the details, but we have seen about a 2% decline in our enrollment since pre-pandemic levels. So what's the solution? Simply put, it's to responsibly align our expenditures with our revenues over time. And what's the timeline for that? Well, this school year, we're going to continue to work through our typical processes to right-size staffing levels, right-size our budgets, and make some limited adjustments similar to what we typically do in our evaluation of programs and services and ensuring that the money that's being spent is appropriate. Next school year will be that work of identifying those larger adjustments that do need to be made to right size and align our revenues and our expenditures with an implementation of a budget that's aligned for the 25-26 school year. And you might be thinking, well, I thought you said you needed to do that for next year. Well, that is true. We did communicate that we anticipated that we would need to align our revenues and expenditures by the 24-25 school year. Well, our budget reserves came in a bit higher this year than anticipated, and that was due to higher enrollment. We did see a slight enrollment increase this year, which does bring in more revenue for the school district. We also had a number of positions that were vacant last year. And when you have a position that's vacant, those dollars do come back as budget reserves in future years. We also made $4.7 million of budget reductions last year. And so that truly did put us in an excellent position this year and will allow us to delay those larger adjustments for another year to the 25-26 school year. And so at a high level, what is the process that any stakeholder can expect from us as we move forward thinking about budget adjustments? Well, first and foremost is communication broadly, but also targeted communication to impacted stakeholders. We have what we call an equity analysis tool here in Lake Washington. It's a tool that helps us ask critical questions about who's impacted, who's benefiting, whose voice are we hearing, but also whose voice aren't we hearing in these decisions. It helps us to make a much more holistic decision as we think about these things. Engagement with our stakeholders, and that can be engagement and input around a decision. It can be engagement or input around the impact of a decision. And then at the end of the day, clearly communicating the decisions that are being made so that people know what to expect as we move forward. And so it provides a very high level overview of our situation, a timeline, and what you can expect moving forward. And as we move into part two, it really is about a much more detailed view of our budget and that type of information. Lake Washington is a large and complex organization. We cover about 76 square miles on the east side of Lake Washington. We have 56 school sites. We have over 4,400 employees when we think about our full-time, part-time, and substitute employees. We're the second largest school district in the state of Washington, serving students in 3 distinct municipalities, Kirkland, Redmond, and about half of Sammamish. But we also have addresses in Bellevue, Woodinville, and unincorporated King County. And our student enrollment is just over 30,600 students that come to school that we serve each and every day. And that is the first year of growth that we've seen in the last 3 years. And as a school district, we are grounded in what we're about, our mission of graduating students and our vision of graduating students future ready to make decisions for themselves. And simply put, it's about equipping every student for a successful future. But we also know that as we think about ensuring our commitment to equity, it's about closing those opportunity and achievement gaps that we know have been pervasive in school systems, because every student that shows up to Lake Washington deserves to achieve excellence. And that really does align with our core focus areas. Each of our schools, our departments, are focused on issues related to equity, inclusionary educational practices, and this idea of what we call MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. It's those academic supports and interventions, high quality instruction that allows our schools to be strategic about how our students are accessing their learning. There's a number of different data points that I could point to that identifies Lake Washington School District as a school district of excellence. The one I want to share tonight is our graduation rate, because the graduation rate isn't just about our high schools doing a great job. It's about our entire system really leaning in and ensuring that students have what they need throughout their educational experience to be able to truly achieve graduation. And so when we think about graduation rates, it's about that preschooler entering the system at 3-4 years old and their entire experience all the way through 12th grade, and ensuring that students have what they need to be successful. And so you can see here about a 10-year look. We achieved our highest 4-year graduation rate this last year at 94.8% of our students graduating within 4 years. We also know that a student's pathway to graduation may be different than peers. And so we track a 4-year, but we also track 5, 6, and 7-year graduation rates. And so this year, we also achieved our highest 7-year graduation rate. So the class of 2020, with 97.2% of students from the class of 2020 demonstrating graduation. And so that's exciting for us, and we are always working to ensure that all of our students have the opportunity to graduate. We're talking about budget tonight, and so I think it's important to also point to some of those benchmarks that we hold ourselves accountable to in terms of excellence in our fiduciary responsibilities here in the district. So there's an outside organization that evaluates school districts and their budgeting practices. And Lake Washington has earned for the 7th year in a row the Meritorious Budget Award. This ensures that our budget practices are aligned with industry standards, that the information that we're putting out to our public is available and accessible, that it's readable to those that aren't within that budget world, and that it makes sense and it is tied back to our strategic direction of the district. And so this is just kind of outside validation that the practices that we're using around budget truly are aligned with industry standards and best practices. And so there's 5 types of funds that we as a district manage. You can see at the top the general fund, but we also have 4 other categories that we manage: our debt services, capital projects, transportation, and our ASB. But when you hear people talk about the district budget, it truly is that general fund, which is the day-to-day operations of our schools and the district. So our annual budget, our general fund budget, is $550 million. And so I want to start with this, and I want to start by talking about the revenue, so the dollars coming into the district. And so you can see since 2017, 2018, we've had steady increases in revenue coming into the district. So a couple things I want to point to here. One, you can see that change from 17-18 to 18-19. That was the implementation of the state's new K-12 funding model went into effect in the 18-19 school year. What we also know is that as revenue increases, that isn't always dollars that are just readily available for the district to make decisions about. More often than not, those increases in revenue have strings attached, and we have to spend those dollars on specific programs and services for students and staff. And so this is the revenue history here in Lake Washington. And I also want to share, like, what are the sources of those revenue categories. The largest driver of revenue is what we call our state apportionment. That's the state funding that we receive for educational services and programs. It is directly driven by our student enrollment. So you can see almost 61% of our revenue comes from the state in that category. That educational programs and operations levy I referenced earlier brings about 16% of our overall revenue. State categorical programs, things like special education, highly capable programs and services, multilingual programs, those are state categorical funds. And then there's some other smaller areas like our fee programs, federal funding, and some other categories such as grants. And knowing that our revenue and enrollment are directly tied to one another, this is kind of a long view of enrollment patterns in Lake Washington School District. And so if you've been here for a period of time, you know that Lake Washington has grown exponentially over the last 10, 12, 13 years. There was a period of time where we were growing by, on average, 600 students annually. That's extremely rapid growth. And you can see here in the 2019-2020 school year, we reached our largest student enrollment at 31,100 students. And you also know what happened at the conclusion of that school year with the pandemic coming online, schools closed, and we entered a much different phase of education and life. And so you can see then for the next 3 years, we saw a reduction or a decline in our student enrollment. And then this year, 23-24, we saw that first uptick in student enrollment again. Now, that doesn't tell the full picture or paint the full picture of our enrollment here in Lake Washington. And so I wanted to share with you by level, because that's also an important set of data as we think about our long-term projections. So you can see in 1920, if we start with that blue bar at the bottom, which is our elementary enrollment, we had about just over 15,000 elementary students. Well, today we have just shy of 14,000 elementary students. We've seen a decline in elementary enrollment by almost 10% over the last 5 years. You can see our middle schools essentially have remained constant during that time, while our high schools have continued to grow, and they're up almost 12% in that same time period. Now, what we know about our elementary enrollment, that truly is one of those predictors of future overall district enrollment, because first graders become second graders become third graders, and so on and so forth. And so if those cohorts of students are smaller as they matriculate up through the system, that means that group of students is going to cause the overall enrollment in the upper grades to be less than it is today. And so that is work that we do with a demographer as we think about the long-term projections to help us understand what we can predict here in the future. For a point of comparison, I wanted to bring this set of data into the room as well. Overall, a data point from last year, K-12 education in the state of Washington had seen a 10% decline in student enrollment. Lake Washington School District is in a very good comparative position compared to our peers in the region. You can see Lake Washington is all the way down at the bottom of this scale. We have seen a 2% decline in our enrollment over the last few years, with only one other district in this data set showing something better than that, and that's the Auburn School District with a 1% growth. And so, as you've probably seen in the news and those types of things, there's districts that are going through significant budget cuts right now. And you can imagine if revenue and enrollment are tied together, if you have an 11, 10, 9% decline in enrollment, that means you're going to have a significant decline in revenue as well. And so when we think about our projections and we work with that expert demographer to help inform this work for us, currently they are continuing to project lower enrollment out into the 5-10 year window here in Lake Washington School District. And that comes from a number of data sets as they make that evaluation. One is the data around birth rates. Here in King County, locally here, specific to Lake Washington School District, we're seeing lower birth rates, which that means in 5 years, those births today become kindergartners here in 5 years. And as we see that lower birth rate, we know how that translates up to kindergarten enrollment. We also know that as we have smaller class sizes and cohorts at the elementary level, again, those will matriculate up into smaller class sizes in our secondary levels. So those are data that we pay attention to. We continue to work with our demographer because they still don't have great trends post-pandemic. Those are starting to be clearer for them, but we also know that there's some other data points that will become clearer in the coming years. So I shared with you the revenue. I also want to talk about expenditures. So revenue, the dollars coming in, expenditures, the dollars that are going out. And so I showed you this revenue picture. These are the same data I showed you a moment ago. Well, we also have our expenditure data that we can look at. And so it's important to note that anytime the blue bar is higher than the gray bar, that means that our expenditures are higher than our revenues. And that means we need to use our budget reserves to fill that gap. And so you might ask, what are we spending our funds on here in Lake Washington? And at a high level, these categories help to kind of describe where dollars are spent in our school district budget. And so that first category, total teaching, about 77%. Well, total teaching is more than just teachers in the classroom. That represents really an umbrella that has instructional assistants, teachers, building-based instructional support staff, our deans of students, paraeducators, instructional assistants, counselors, librarians, but it also incorporates some supplies, materials, textbooks, professional development, safety. So it's a large umbrella that really does focus on those building-based supports. That building administration category is, yes, our building administrators, our principals and our associate principals, but also office staff and folks that help to administer and run the building. Maintenance and operations supports, our central administration. Again, yes, that's administrators, our directors, our executive directors, those folks, but it's also our staff that work in our departments in areas such as payroll, human resources, business and finance, and some of our IT staff. Some examples of, I'll just say, challenges associated with expenditures. I identified earlier that we aren't fully funded by the state for some of our programs and services. And so want to bring in data around the areas where we are receiving state funding. You can see here, these are areas you're probably familiar with: certificated staff, athletics and activities, our classified staff, our IAs, our paraeducators, those folks, CTE programs, special education. So, these are all things that you're familiar with, and they're not all fully funded by the state. And so this red bar, portion of the bar, shows what are those areas that we are required to fund locally with our levy dollars to be able to fill the gap between what the state provides and what is needed. Another data point that I think it's important for us to be aware of is, as the state made their changes around K-12 funding across the state, they also required that staff receive an inflationary adjustment. And that's a good thing for our staff. It keeps people gainfully employed, knowing that they receive a cost of living adjustment. And the state doesn't fully fund that cost of living adjustment. And so we as a district have to backfill and fund a portion of the cost of living adjustment that's required by the state. And so just want to walk through these data with you. So in the 2019-2020 fiscal year, the inflationary adjustment, or the cost of living adjustment, was 2% for staff. So staff received that, but the district was required to fund about $1.2 million of that cost of living adjustment. And that's true every year, that we are having to pay district dollars to cover that state requirement. And so you can see over the last 5 years, we funded about $14 million of state inflationary adjustment, with an estimated $4.9 million in the 24-25 school year. So that is just something that we are having to manage within our revenue and expenditures, knowing that we get some revenue for it, but not enough to actually cover the requirement. Another and very practical example of increasing costs, something that all of us are experiencing in our own personal lives, and that's the impact of inflation on a variety of different aspects. Well, these data here in front of you are related to our property and liability insurance costs. And so you can see back in 17-18 school year, we were paying about $1.9 million for our annual premiums for our property and liability insurance. This year, we're paying about $6.5 million in that property and liability insurance. And so you can imagine that is a significant increase that we're having to respond to, and we're required to have that insurance. And so it isn't optional to be able to pay for it or not. It is something we have to build into our expenditure program, and we're not seeing requisite increases in state funding for things like insurance. Okay, continuing along this journey of really working to understand our revenues, expenditures, but there's another aspect that I want to talk about. And so here's our revenues, here's our expenditures that I've showed you. Well, there's another key part to our district budget. It's something that we call fund balance. It really is our budget reserves. Budget reserves are one-time dollars. The corollary to that is a personal savings account. And you all know once you use that savings account, those dollars are gone. They can't be reused. And so our fund balance truly is a one-time dollars that once they're spent, they can't be used again. Down here at the bottom of the page, there's going to be a number that identifies what we're calling the fiscal gap. And so a black number will show an increase in our overall budget reserves. A red number will show you that we had to reduce or use our fund balance to be able to cover our expenditures. And so you can see back in 2017, 2018, we had an overall fund balance of $47.4 million. And up here at the top, our blue bar is larger than our gray bar, which means we had to use about $5 million of our fund balance, our budget reserves, to be able to cover those expenditures that year. As we entered into the change in state funding, you can see that our fund balance did grow for 2 years in a row. And then we started to intentionally spend down our fund balance. With this year, this last year, our fund balance ended the year at $67.9 million. And so what I do know is that this intentionality of growing our fund balance to respond to the changes in state funding truly did allow us to respond to the pandemic differently than many districts. And so we did use our budget reserves to be able to fund many of the pandemic impacts, knowing that we received very little federal relief dollars to be able to provide those supports for our students in our community. So a very tangible example, I want to walk through this year's budget, revenues, expenditures, and the impact of our fund balance. And like I said before, fund balance is like our district savings, so those dollars that we have in reserves. We have a policy requirement to have a minimum fund balance of 5%, but we know that that isn't the right amount. That is a minimum, and so maintaining a budget reserve between that 7 to 10% allows us to respond to emergent issues or emergencies in the system. And so this year, Lake Washington has revenue of $524 million. We have expenditures listed at $541 million. And so that's a gap of about $17 million. We know we're starting this year. We ended last year with 67.9, and we're starting this year with 67.9 in our reserves. And given this equation, that means we will end this school year with $50.8 million in our budget reserves. And this has been an intentional process to bring our fund balance down to really a level that's appropriate, knowing that the dollars we get for students really should be provided for students' programs and services in that period of time. And as we think about what's ahead. So as I said before, we always are thinking about projections. And so what can we reasonably project given the assumptions that we know, given the data that we have about future years. And so this slide will share with you our revenue projections. And so you can see that we are projecting that our revenue will continue to grow. That growth in revenue is all tied to required expenditures. And so if nothing changes in our budget, you can see that we continue to have our expenditures higher than our revenues, which means our fund balance would continue to be accessed, and it would reach a level that, number one, isn't in alignment with our policy requirements, but it also puts us in a situation where we don't have those reserves to be able to respond appropriately. And so a lot of information on this slide, but I want to start with the middle column here. And so last school year, you may be aware that we did quite a bit of budget work, and the net effect of that was we reduced our expenditures by $4.7 million for the 23-24 budget. And so really appreciate all the work that went into that, because that really did set us up to be positioned well this year. As I move over to the left, 4.7 was the net effect. We actually reduced our expenditures overall by 11.9 million. But part of our budget work isn't just about cutting, it's also about funding our priorities and our strategic direction. And so there were a number of programs and services that we funded through the process last year to support our inclusionary practices, to support our middle and high school behavioral and mental health supports. And so there was a lot of different things that we were able to do through that process last year. And with all great plans, we also have to be aware of what are those variables or conditions that could change our situation. And so I have 4 things I want to share with you. First, knowing that enrollment is directly connected to revenue, any significant increase or decrease in enrollment will change our revenue picture. And so if we experience a significant increase in enrollment, that would be a very positive impact to our revenue picture. But the converse is true as well. A significant decrease in enrollment would significantly impact the revenue that we are anticipating we will receive. The state legislature is currently meeting, and they could increase state funding for school districts, which would have a positive impact. But we also know that as the legislature does their work, at times they make changes, and they don't always fund those total changes for school districts. Here it's listed as an unfunded legislative mandate, but anytime there's a requirement of school district that doesn't come with requisite funding to be able to enact that, requires us as a school district to plan for that in the expenditure column, even though we may not be receiving revenue for it. And finally, that last piece that I shared with you before about those fixed costs. So I shared with you the insurance piece, but we all have fixed costs that we're managing, our utilities and those components, and just those ongoing impacts of inflation are affecting all of us, including K-12. And so what's next? It's important for you to walk away knowing that we have a budget situation where we do need to get our expenditures and our revenue back into alignment. It's about 2.7% of our total budget, making adjustments of about $11 to $15 million. And so this year, we're going to continue our typical budget work of right-sizing our staffing models, ensuring that we evaluate our budget programs and practices as we always do, because we're always considering how can we make sure that we are using our public dollars as effective as possible and making those limited adjustments. We have a number of committees that are currently working, focused on our strategic plan and a number of different aspects. We have I believe, over 150 to 200 stakeholders engaged in that committee work, and their feedback and input will be critical as we think about the future of Lake Washington and budget decisions that will be made. And then our 25-26 school year really will be where we implement those adjustments with a budget that is truly aligned with revenues and expenditures, which allows us to have a sustainable budget into the future. And so again, in summary, about $11 to $15 million adjustments. This year, we'll continue our budget work. In spring of 2025, all stakeholders should have a clear understanding of what those changes and adjustments will be for that next school year, with that implementation in the 25-26 school year. And so we do want to move to part 3, our question and answer portion of our agenda tonight. So please keep putting your questions into that, click on that Q up by, don't hit the leave button, hit the Q button, and enter those questions, and we'll go ahead and look at those. Before I actually invite some guests to share with you, I want you to know that all of this information is on our district website. Some of the questions, as I said before, that you provide tonight will end up in an FAQ. And so a frequently asked questions document will also be present here to respond to your questions tonight. And so with that, I do want to invite Associate Superintendent Barbara Posthumus to the screen. She is leading our Budget Advisory Committee, and she has some of our Budget Advisory Committee members here to share with you some comments about the work that they're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Holman. Yeah, I'm excited. We've got 2 people with us tonight who are members of our Budget Advisory Committee. We have Kristen Dorwin and Lakshmi Jala, and unfortunately, Kristen, we had some technical difficulties, so she's joining us by phone, but you have a picture of her. So I'm going to ask them some questions, and we'll just start. Kristen, can you share what the Budget Advisory Committee is?
Sure. Hi, my name is Kristen Dorwin. Hopefully you can hear me. I have a sophomore in the district and also a freshman in college who graduated from Oneida High School last year. The Budget Advisory Committee is made up of parents and community members, staff, and we actually even have a couple of student members in the committee. We meet monthly. We've had 4 meetings so far. And we're kind of serving as a source of guidance and feedback and advice to the district. So before they sent out a survey to all of you asking for your input on the budget, we took a look at the survey and helped them sort of tweak that and make sure that they were asking the right kind of questions to get good feedback from folks. So we're just helping with gathering questions and giving them ideas and sort of working to plan for continuing to work with the district every year to give advice and feedback on the budget, so that this is sort of an ongoing feedback loop and process.
Great, thank you, Kristen. And Lakshmi, you can turn your camera on and unmute. And can you tell us something that you have learned being part of the Budget Advisory Committee?
Hi everyone, I am Lakshmi Jala. My daughter is a senior in East Lake High School. So we learned first thing how the budget works at Lake Washington school districts, how the money is allocated from various agencies, from state government and local governments. The second aspect that we learned is how the budget is allocated to various initiatives and various programs at Lake Washington school district. And the third aspect is we learned how the budget gap is going to be for the next 2 years coming into the next fiscal years. And the final one is we reviewed the survey conducted by the district and submitted by parents, students and staff, and we listened to their priorities where they want the important aspects of their concerns to be addressed.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing. And again, I've been appreciating the collaboration and connection with the community and with the parents, and it's been great to have student voice on the committee. It's a very thoughtful group, and so we'll continue our work. We meet each month, and information is on the website. So thank you both for being willing to share your experiences tonight. So I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Holman.
Well, actually, Barbara, I'm going to have you stay on the screen because we have some questions that I think you're positioned very well to answer. So the first question, with so many residential construction and new apartments constantly coming up in Lake Washington School District served areas, why is enrollment showing a 2% decline from pre-pandemic levels? And are there temporary declines before an upswing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it used to be, 10, 15 years ago, a lot of the new construction was single family, and now it is multifamily. And what we know is multifamily right now does not generate as many students as a single family development. So part of it is that it's a lot more housing units, but there's for every 100 apartment units, you might only get 10 students, where for every 100 single family units, you'd get 30 to 50 students. So that's part of it. The other part of our enrollment decline is we are seeing lower enrollment in our elementary schools. So as we shared in the presentation, our elementary schools have declined about 10%, and that's driven partly by our births are also declining. So our kindergarten enrollment, the number of births 5 years earlier impacts our kindergarten enrollment. So all those factors are playing into our enrollment declines.
Great. Another question for you, Barbara. It really is a question about alternative forms of revenue. And so is the school district considering other ways of raising revenue instead of making budget cuts?
Yeah, the district certainly can look at both the revenue picture and the expenditure picture. So there are fees for certain things that we charge, such as our fee-based programs, our extended day programs, our athletics and activities. So we certainly could look at increasing fees to bring in revenues, but the majority of that won't probably offset all the cuts that we have to make. The other thing I know we've heard out in the community, we have a lot of major corporations in our community. Can we just ask them for donations? And that's certainly an option, but what we have to remember is the donations have to be a commitment every year in order for them to really have an impact on the budget picture. They really have to be an ongoing commitment. So yeah.
Okay, a question we actually thought about answering in our budget presentation, because it's a question we know we get asked quite often, and it's about central and building administrative costs. And so the question is 11% funding for central and building administration similar to other comparable school districts?
Yeah, and we've looked at the comparisons of central office specifically. That was the 4.6%. Within that 11%, there's 4.7% shown on central office. And we actually looked at our comparison to other districts, and we have the lowest percentage of budget spent on our central office compared to other districts in our area. So despite being larger than all districts, we have the lowest central office. So we can certainly add to our FAQ the piece about building administrators as well.
Okay, a couple more questions for you, and then I'll take a couple of these questions as well. Okay. Can you share, so if people want more information about really those categories of expenditures, like things like the number of teachers, number of administrators, where would they go and find that information?
So they can go there. The budget documents are on our website, and we have what we call kind of our user-friendly meritorious budget award budget document that provides really details of revenues and expenditures by program area. So different ways of how we're spending those dollars. And then we have a more detailed document, kind of our state budget format, that has consistent information. Every school district in the state has this budget document, and it's called our F195. It's the second link that's on our website there. And in that document is a breakout of not only dollars spent, but FTE, or positions in each program area. So you should be able to find all of that on our website.
Okay, one final question for you. Can you talk about if enrollment is higher than projected, how does that impact the overall operations budget?
Yeah, when enrollment comes in higher than projected, we certainly are receiving additional state revenues for that. And we are also having to hire teachers and staff to support that higher enrollment. And so over time, though, when you have rapid growth, like we did pre-pandemic, usually your revenues when you're growing are outpacing your expenditures. And then when you're losing enrollment, usually your revenues decline faster than your expenditures because of those fixed cost areas that we also shared with you. So, so certainly higher enrollment can help with that revenue picture.
So I'm going to take a couple of questions here. A question about graduation rates. I shared information that we achieved our highest graduation rate here in Lake Washington just this last year. And the question really is, are higher graduation rates linked to increases in funding? And will budget cuts put that success at risk? And I think part of the response is that's why we're doing so much of this committee work, because we are positioned well with our budget, comparatively to many of our neighbors. Our 2.7% reduction that we're targeting in the next 2 years is extremely small compared to peers. And as we think about ensuring that those programs and practices that truly are linked to student success, that we continue to fund those and evaluate our programs and services to make sure that those that maybe aren't having that same level of impact or benefit, that we figure out how do we walk away from those. And so that's really the art of making these budget adjustments, because our commitment to our students doesn't change. Our work towards ensuring that all students graduate doesn't change just because we're going through a budget adjustment process. It's really about the most efficient and effective ways to address student needs. So I appreciate that, and that is something that we are keeping top of mind as well. There's a question about how do our large employers such as Microsoft or Google influence our enrollment, and as they continue to expand their workforce, do we expect our enrollment to increase or decrease? And I can tell you, we partner with our local employers to understand kind of what direction they're going. If they're thinking about increasing their workforce, we ask them to let us know when they're thinking about decreasing their workforce, because those things do have an impact. You look around our community, we are truly an international location here in Lake Washington School District, and many people move from across the globe to work at these places like Microsoft and Google. And so we know that there is a link between families moving here and those employers. And we also know that as families move out, we know that other families can also move into those vacated houses. And so again, our demographer also is working on those aspects, and that plays a role into their projections. But we do know that our local employers do have an impact on our enrollment. Let's see. Well, Barbara, they have more questions for you, and so why don't you you jump back on the screen. And I'm going to ask you to respond to construction funding. And there's a question about what portion of construction comes from the state versus local dollars, and can you differentiate between the different budget types for construction and operations?
Great question. Yeah, so again, primarily we've been talking about the operating budget tonight. We also have what's called a capital projects fund, and that's where both our facilities and our technology levy funds are deposited. And the facilities levy pays for our, major improvements such as roofing and safety improvements, and then our technology levy pays for all the technology that we use across the district and our technology infrastructure. And the other bucket that goes into that capital projects funds is construction levies and bonds. So that's where the funds come from. And the question is, what does the state provide? And really the state provides almost zero funding to support construction of new schools related to growth. The only thing that the state provides right now is, they call it construction. They will give districts a small match for rebuilding aging schools. So when we rebuild an aging school, we have to front fund those dollars. So we have to have approved funding to build schools, and then we apply to the state to receive reimbursement for a portion of those costs, and it's called School Construction Assistance Program. And we get about 8%. It's different for each project, but we get about 8% of the project cost from the state for construction. And we get zero funds from the state when we are building new buildings.
Okay, Barbara, I'm going to have you answer one last question.
Okay.
And then I'm going to go ahead and wrap up with a couple responses, and then thank people for participating tonight. Do we have any data around, and this is an enrollment question, any data about families choosing private or homeschooling, which has led to lower enrollment?
Yeah, we do. We have statewide information or state information on homeschooling or enrollment, but the primary driver that, and again, I'll put some of that data in the FAQ, but the primary driver of our lower enrollment is the lower birth rates. And so we're seeing, again, lower kindergarten come in, and because of the declining birth rate over time.
Great, thank you. Okay, there's a number of questions about specific programs and services, and are they going to be reduced or cut and things like that. Tonight isn't about what adjustments will be made. The commitment that we make is around communication, engagement, and process, knowing that decisions about any specific program, service, or adjustment will be made during next school year in preparation for the 25-26 school year. There's a number of committees that are working on the various questions that we're seeing come in right now. And we also know that it's important that all stakeholders have a clear understanding of what decisions are being made, how they're being considered, and how they can have input into that process. And so to wrap this up, we received a couple questions around, will this be recorded and will the slide deck be available? The answer to that is both is yes. And we will have links to those in our budget sections of our website, so that those that weren't able to be here tonight are able to watch it. Or if someone wants to look at the slide deck that we presented tonight, you'll have access to that. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you to all of those of you that came out tonight to hear this information, provide questions to us. A number of the questions we received are perfect for an FAQ document, so you can look for that to come out as well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up our evening tonight. Thank you so much, and we appreciate your support.